And there we go. Good afternoon. We're going to get started. And it's about a little after our time. I think people are still going to probably wander in. My name is David Dickey. I am the mayor. I think I know most all of you. We have some people on the Zoom, and that we're going to be recording, obviously, in a very fancy way, for anybody who misses and wants to go back and look and hear about the discussions. So I think that'll be good for some of the board members who could not come. I want to start by thanking each and every one of you for serving. One of the things I think makes our city really unique and very special is that residents take their time and their talent to serve on our boards. And every one of you, including the elected officials, are volunteers, and each of you help make our city better all the time. So thank you all for serving, and many of you have served for a long, long time. So we're going to do introductions. We'll go around and maybe name what board you serve on. If you've served on multiple boards, tell us that too. Some of you have, and that experience is valuable. And the goal for today, we have an agenda, and we have some things to talk about. Oftentimes we also talk about things that just pop up because all of our boards are intertwined, and some more so than others, but they all intertwine in ways, in some cases, that we don't always see every day. And so this dialogue helps to shape individual board conversations, policy, and other things that we do in the city, and it's very, very helpful. So please be engaged, please raise your hand, ask questions, and make your opinions be known. So again, David Dickey, I am the mayor. I am in my second term. Before that, 10 years on council, 2 years as city treasurer. Good.
Oh, I've got a mic. Am I on?
Yep.
Okay. David Sargent, Sargent Town Planning. We're based in Southern California, and we've had the pleasure and privilege of working with you folks about 10 years ago to prepare the original design guidelines, and we've had a chance to make some updates to them over about 4 or 5 years ago, and we're very pleased and grateful that you have asked us again to assist you with facing some new challenges. And really, we see this as an amazing opportunity to make what's already a very strong, useful document a lot stronger and more useful for your staff, for your boards, and your policymakers, to make sure that you keep Mission Hills, and let it evolve without losing the wonderful place you've got. So thank you for inviting us. And Peter Vanderwall, who was our senior designer then, and now he's the managing partner of the firm, is going to be on Zoom also in a little bit.
Jennifer Lee, oh gosh, that was loud, city administrator. And just a note that in order to be heard on the Zoom, you need to speak into a microphone. So as we have questions and comments and stuff, if you'll wait to get a handheld, that'd be great. Thanks so much.
Jill Clifton, city planner.
Anna Kirstelich, city attorney.
Todd Alt, city architect. Bryce Morgan, planner.
Barbara Nelson, 13 years on the city council. There must be a prize for that.
She's the prize.
Stacy Winfield, Architectural Review Board. I think I've been on there 7 years.
Gail Cluin, Architectural Review Board.
David Banks, ARB.
David Gibson, ARB.
Laura Lee Gibson, Park Board.
Eden Thorne, City Council.
Nancy Ruzica, Planning Commission, and before that, ARB.
Bill Brenning, City Council.
Judy Moore, Board of Zoning Appeals.
Casey Halsey, BZA.
Kent Barno, BZA.
And Gabe Beam, BZA.
Excellent. Again, thank you all for being here and taking the time. A couple things to talk about before we get into our main agenda. This fall, in November, we will be putting before the residents the renewal of the 0.25% sales tax, which we passed 5 years ago with a 5-year sunset. We passed it to specifically focus on infrastructure, which we've done. So hopefully you will advocate for that and tell your friends that we spent the money exactly how we said we would. As I said in my last newsletter, if you just drive across the state line, you can see what the difference the infrastructure looks like, even if you drive just to our west in Prairie Village. So we're proud of that, and hopefully we can pass that again. Crime and safety has been a focus always. Last year in particular, obviously last year was a tough year. This year is better for home burglaries, and it would be really better if people would lock their cars. So up until in August, of the 8 vehicles that were broken into, all 8 were unlocked. Of the 3 that were stolen, they were all unlocked with their keys in them. So if you could please tell your friends, lock your cars. We had the first in a long time where somebody smashed a window. That was at Indian Hills Country Club last week. So it doesn't happen very often. It's really unlocked cars that are our biggest problem. That brings criminals back, and so we do not want them to come back. If we make it hard, they will not come. From a resource perspective, our website is new and improved. We have a planning and building guide, and then we've instituted See-Click-Fix. So See-Click-Fix allows you to submit a question, a problem, whatever, online, and then you'll get updates if you want them. So it's a good advancement for us to communicate with residents. So please take advantage of that. And then we have 3 remaining community engagement events this year. We have Dinner of Verona this Saturday from 6 to 10:30. Yes. October 1st, we're trying movie night at City Hall Park, and then November 20th is the tree lighting at City Hall. So those are coming. Any questions before we jump into roles and responsibilities of the board? Anna, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mayor. So in your packets, there are sheets that go through each board, and it provides details about membership, terms, quorums, when the meetings occur, and basically what they involve. So I'll just give a pretty broad overview, and I'd welcome any questions. So Planning Commission is responsible for monitoring development trends in the city and recommending amendments to the zoning regulations, the subdivision regulations, which is primarily for plats, and the design guidelines as necessary to manage development in the city. They also administer and recommend revisions to the comprehensive plan that identifies goals, principles, and policies for citywide development. And then they review and approve plats. The ARB implements a lot of the provisions that are, the amendments to the zoning regulations that are recommended by the Planning Commission, but just in generally reviewing all applications for building permits, except for certain projects that have been approved to be for administrative review and approval. And this is based on established criteria that are set forth in the zoning regulations. And they ensure that all structures in the city conform to certain minimum architectural and aesthetic standards, and that all structures generally conform with surrounding structures. And they also ensure conformity to the zoning regulations, design guidelines, and comprehensive plan. The Board of Zoning Appeals considers appeals from decisions of the ARB and city officials who administer the zoning regulations or the building code. And they also consider requests for variances from the zoning regulations. And there's also specified criteria that forms the basis of whether or not to approve variances, and those are based on state statute. The benefits to the city is that they provide some flexibility and fairness when the strict enforcement of the zoning regulations would cause unnecessary hardship, typically for properties that are unique or have some particularly unique issue or that would prevent them from complying with the regulations. And then again, conducting appellate review of any alleged errors in ARB or city official decisions. The professional review panel reviews building permit applications for substantial construction matters. This is primarily new houses. They make formal recommendations to the ARB, whether to approve the plans as submitted, approve with changes, or deny. They ensure that substantial construction matters conform to certain minimum architectural and aesthetic standards of appearance and conform with surrounding structures like the ARB, and also ensure conformity to the zoning regulations and design guidelines. The Park Board's emphasis is on the public areas of the city, so the public rights-of-way and public parks. They review the landscape and hardscape and recommend appropriate modifications. They also develop a list of recommended tree species for planting in the rights-of-way, and educate city residents about value, maintenance, and health of trees and shrubs, and also address other issues that might be affecting the trees and plants in the city. And their primary goal is to ensure the continued park and garden-like setting of the city. There's a sheet in here about council liaisons. Council members are assigned to act as liaisons to the Planning Commission, Architectural Review Board, Board of Zoning Appeals, Crime Prevention and Safety Committee, and the Park Board. And they attend meetings and report back to council the activities of the applicable board. And then the final sheet in the packet is really just an overview of the Kansas Open Meetings Act and requirements. And there's a comment here about executive sessions and deliberative sessions, just to give you an idea of when those are allowed. Deliberative sessions are for quasi-judicial decisions. So this would be something that the Planning Commission, the Architectural Review Board, and the Board of Zoning Appeals would be able to do when they are considering matters that affect a particular property as opposed to the city as a whole. So then you would be, in those instances, you're not necessarily subject to the Open Meetings Act, and you can go into a closed session to discuss. Otherwise, an executive session would be required, and there are very specific requirements about that. We typically will prepare a motion that lays out all of those requirements for the applicable body to make sure that we're complying with them and that they end up on the record. And again, if you have any questions about any of this, I'd be happy to go into more detail. Hearing none. Thank you.
Jill's first. Thank you, guys. Can we get the first slide of our presentation up, please? So we've prepared a bunch of slides, mostly images of homes that are here. Just a quick summary of what the guidelines already cover, in which we'll highlight some things some places where we think they can be strengthened a bit, and then I'm going to go through a little section where we'll talk about some of the most common issues that we have been seeing and hearing about as we review projects and speak with your staff about them. And then the last section is going to be just some preliminary ideas about how we would recommend updating and strengthening the guidelines, and we'd hope just to hear from you. We're just going to give you a series of suggestions, and then if you think they're about right, you can tell us, and if you think we're missing something, you can tell us. So that we get a lot. The wonderful thing about the initial guidelines preparation process was that it was so interactive. We had a series of meetings here in this room. We heard from a lot of folks, and all of our ideas are better than anyone's ideas. So we just want this to be as collaborative as possible. So the current guidelines were prepared for a variety of reasons. Overall, they were to make sure houses were wonderful and fit into Mission Hills, but one of the key problems that the guidelines were intended to solve was inappropriate siting and massing of houses. You were getting houses that were too big and too close to other houses because the zoning was not set up to make Mission Hills stay Mission Hills. It was just set up to require, setbacks and height limits like zoning everywhere else, and you were getting some real inappropriate, unexpected results. So the guidelines were set up mostly to make sure that the big part of the house was in the middle of the lot and the smaller parts of the houses were closer to the neighbors and that no house came too close to any neighbor. And in Chapter 1 of the guidelines, we did a lot of analysis and a lot of interaction with the folks of the community to see what the beautiful patterns that J.C. Nichols and his very talented design team had envisioned and created initially, and how to protect the green space from intrusions by buildings and too much pavement. And essentially came up with the diagram of the main mass of the house in the middle of the lot and the smaller wings as you get closer to the edges. However, we did not address in a straight ahead way the question of the internal proportions within the house. That's what I'm going to focus on a lot in the following slides. There's a great opportunity to tighten up guidance about the proportions of the facade to porches, to wings, to the roof, etc. Oh, and I'm sorry, I think I skipped by one. No, okay. So the guidelines really describe the main mass area and the wing area and etc. And what's been happening lately is that architects and their clients have been sort of filling up that whole area with just house. And you're getting some big, square, blocky houses as a result. And there's some simple adjustments we think that can be made to the guidelines to tone that down. And we defined the three basic, again, we decide the main mass, front projections, and wings. Actually, there's an opportunity to more clearly differentiate between what's a front wing and what's just a front projection. The Tudor houses are characterized by the big gables that face the street, but they don't come forward like a wing. They only come forward like 3, 4, 5, 6 feet. So it's simple to make that clearer in the guidelines. And we looked carefully at relationships between houses on lower lots and higher lots with recommendations to scale the building on the upper lot down and not lift it unnecessarily and not grade too much the ideal would be to not really grade much at all, just to set the house on the sloping site and conform it to the site. And we had guidelines for when you're pretty close, how close is too close and how do you stop that from happening. That still happens, and we can, I think, add some provisions that make it clearer how to avoid that problem. They also define the classic styles of Mission Hills, but they really describe them. They don't provide guidelines for the styles. They just describe the styles and expect the architects and the reviewers to figure that out. We think there's some additional clarity that can be provided about which types of elements and their proportions and dimensions that belong with each of these classic styles. We have sort of most of the material is in there already. We can connect it more in ways that'll be more helpful, we think, to the designers and the reviewers. We defined, we showed some examples of what not to do in terms of sort of overblown massing and just too much stuff on the front of the house. But we said, well, don't do that. But we didn't, as clearly as we could now, describe what to do. So that's something. And then the sort of the big, deep houses with the complicated roofs, we said, don't do that. Well, that is being done some, and we can provide clearer guidance than just say, don't do that. We can provide some more step-by-step clarity on the design and the review process to help, dodge that bullet and see it coming a little sooner. So that in the update, we're going to define more clearly what a main mass is, but it's not just a block. It consists of a facade. Most of the facades of the classic, colonial, actually Tudor, certainly neoclassical, also Mediterranean, the big two-story estates, almost always the facade is somewhere between a double square and a triple square in proportion, and the roof is always smaller. And the wings are smaller than that. That's what makes it work. And we can define how many gables on the front is too many. We can make that numerical, and we can key it to how wide the house is or how large the lot is. We described what's a main mass, but we didn't really get into much detail about how much is too much to stick on the front of it. Also, we've been seeing more one-story houses than we thought we would. Now, that's certainly understandable. That's a nationwide trend. A lot of people prefer, well, good grief, ever since the 50s, when the houses in the south part of Mission Hills were built, a lot of people like a more horizontal plan where all the rooms open directly into the yard or the garden. And the sort of the logic and the design vocabulary for long, low houses is just different than it is for big two-story, 2.5-story estate houses. And we can recognize that more directly and clearly in the guidelines than we do so far. So I think a lot of the houses that end up being sort of cluttery looking are the architect sincerely trying to make a horizontal house look vertical, and sometimes the results just sort of border on silliness. And you know, the classic one-story houses are beautiful, and you can have more of them, and you can have them in styles similar to, and even maybe that aren't yet here much. And even on the classic Tudors, the rules are a little different for those than they are for the central vertical massing. Because, for instance, a lot of the Tudor houses, if you just look at sort of what's the main roof, it's really wide, but it doesn't appear really wide because one of these beautiful picturesque gables essentially breaks it into two visually. If you're looking down from the air, it's all one big roof, but it has this big piece in front that breaks the scale down. That's very important. We can make that clearer in the guidelines. We strongly suggest then that an early meeting with staff, probably, maybe with the town architect, occur sort of like the current pre-design meeting, but in those pre-design meetings, you're getting a footprint drawing on a lot of these, where it's just sort of a black, okay, there's where the building is, but there's no roof plan, there's no simple massing model like this one, so you don't find out, like, so where's the main mass on this house? You don't find that out until they've invested, you know, $50,000, $60,000, $100,000 in drawings, at which point, you know, they're kind of resistant to starting over. So we think identifying the basic massing scheme early, and what style is it that you're going to clothe this massing scheme in. And it might be at that time that they're coming in with a vertical massing scheme, but they're choosing a horizontal style, or vice versa. And that could be pointed out early in the process when they have plenty of time to adjust, and you don't get into a difficult situation at the end. And we just defined these 7 styles, actually a couple of which really aren't styles. Contemporary isn't really a style. Contemporary just means, well, somebody recently thought that looked good. Well, that's not a style. So we'll propose to prepare a new sort of guidelines and process description for the adaptive styles. If you're going to adapt a style, what's the style? How are you adapting it? Rather than just, well, we thought this looked good. And we can also tighten the correlation between massing typology and style, because there's some obvious correlations, the most clear one being between Tudor and picturesque. They're almost synonyms for each other. But there are picturesque styles other than Tudor, and there are ways of applying some of the elements of Tudor architecture to more horizontal buildings, but it's real tricky, and we can add some guidance. So the guidelines can basically connect the dots between massing, style, and detailing. And there are some branches of some of these families that are not yet mentioned. That's French country. Now, that's not the French. You've been getting some sort of, like, in some cases, some sort of, you know, tract house reinterpret, you know, contemporary interpretation of French country. Well, French country, they were originally just stone farmhouses that looked almost exactly like the Mediterranean stone farmhouses. They were just a couple clicks north, and they detailed the roofs a little different with the flares at the end. But we can define some of those styles so that rather than dealing with sort of third-generation derivatives of styles, you can look at the real thing and think of how could we either just do that or adapt that in a simple way. Okay, Peter, do you want to speak to this, or shall I keep going?
I think you can keep going, David. I think it's fairly simple. We're just talking about where we're potentially inserting some of these new guidelines.
Okay, and Peter's the one that's been leading our work on this for the last 5 years or so. And he's figured a lot of this stuff out, and I just get to come tell you what we think. So we're gonna edit and simplify the massing guidelines in section 2 to be more focused on to be focused on the massing of the house itself, not just the massing of the boxes in relation to the site plan. So that because that's where a lot of the proportions are showing up as just awkward, and that in some cases that's just a lack of skill on the part of the designer. In some cases that's probably prioritizing site planning over making a great house. So we think, and obviously you can do both. There's so many examples of doing both, and the guidelines can better support that by adding some massing standards, some massing guidelines into the description of those massing typologies. Then we'll have a new building massing guidelines section right before the architectural guidelines section. And then we'll include in the architectural guidelines some cross connections back to the massing. So if you're doing this kind of massing, this is the kind of architectural techniques you need to use. You need to emphasize the front plane of the building, or you need to emphasize roofs and dormers, just connections between style and massing. And then in the appendix, in the characteristics of styles of Mission Hills, we think those can be more complete, and we can also maybe add a few styles, because I think there are other styles that are being done, and sometimes being done well, and sometimes, being done not well. And by simply defining how to do them well, I think that'll help. So one of the key issues is the roofs are too big. Well, that happens when you put a two-story house roof on a one-story house. And if that roof was on a two-story house, it would look about right. But it looks like a 10. Some of these start to look like a 10-gallon hat on a Chihuahua. It's just not the right size of a hat for that house. So you're getting these. So, and this isn't an inviolable rule, but we think in general, we've looked at hundreds and hundreds of photographs of houses from Mission Hills. Pretty much all the good ones, the height of the roof is the same as or less than the height of the facade that it's sitting on. And so some of these are really just, so it's a combination. Well, there's another slide that'll tell that better. I'll just move on. This is just the intro. So, but with keeping control of the main mass depth, artfully controlling the roof pitch, and thinking carefully about the height of the facade, that can be rebalanced in a more pleasing way. So the essential characteristics we think that apply to every house in Mission Hills, some of these are already in the intro, but if they're not, they will be. Just houses sitting there quietly and calmly in the green space. They're not shouting, "Hey, look at me," and they're not doing "Oh, look what I can do." They're not trying to show you every trick they know. They're just being a big house there calmly in the green space. Understated elegance. When in doubt, leave it out. The massing is clear and simple and tightly related to the chosen style. And you can mess around with them, but you need to mess around with them starting with a classic example of the style you're messing around with, and you need to know what you're doing when you mess. Houses are large, typically not little bungalows, but the horizontal houses of the south part of Mission Hills are another subject that we'll talk about in the modern, mid-century, and potentially contemporary styles. The front entries are strong and obvious and welcoming visitors from the street, and the materials and detailing are very high quality. That should be the ante into this game every time. Many of the recent proposals have too many pieces coming off the front. It's like, so I see 3 wings there, but where's the house? And that has to do with applying a very vertical style to a rather short house. And we can add dimensional requirements for the wings to make sure they're lower than the house. And if you're going to have front wings coming out, they should be creating, an entry space that someone comes through, instead of just, jamming another one in there. And the massing aberrations in the guidelines sort of show what not to do, but we haven't described plainly enough, why not do that, what not to do and why not to do it. So, one-story houses are a big subject. And a lot of the houses that have been, I think, generated controversy, and when we look at the drawings, we think that they need work, are one-story houses. Well, Mission Hills has a fantastic tradition of lovely mid-20th century one-story houses. And one of the main things that characterizes them, well, a couple things. One, they're low. 2, they're calm. 3, most of them employ traditional detailing. Many of these one-story houses in the 60s down south have pretty much colonial window detailing, which is it's cool. So they're just one-story houses that aren't shouting. They're just sitting there looking calm and nice. Now there's one that's under construction now that we have a couple things to say about, but it's got a roof that we think is kind of too big, and the body of the well, I have another slide for that, but it's trying to make a short house look tall, we think, and then sometimes people just put too many things on the front. I mean, a couple of those wings on the two ends would be fine. Maybe if the house is wide enough, 3, but then there's this sort of vaguely Italianate entry pavilion thing in between there. We looked at this morning, and that's not there yet, but apparently it's still going to be. There's ways, if you want to do the classic styles, there's ways to do them in one story. You want to do one-story neoclassical? How about that? You want to do one-story contemporary with contemporary or modern reinterpretations of bay windows on the fronts of those 2 wings, and a deep porch and a simple horizontal roof that's nowhere near as tall as the buildings. That's pretty simple and clear. And we even, now some of these are questions. There's also, you've got Mediterranean, and you've got Mediterranean, and you've got, and we want to hear, at the end we're going to have Q&A where we want to hear from you. But there's the Spanish colonial revival style, which has lots of branches, of which this is just one, which is both picturesque and it lends itself to one story. Whereas the Tudor, it's difficult to do the Tudor picturesque in a low house. There's a lot of ways you can do Spanish colonial revival. There's another style that we think has a lot of promise. You've got mid-century houses, you've got modern houses. You don't, as near as we can tell, have any mid-century modern houses. Well, mid-century modern is a fantastic style. Now, I'll admit that mid-century modern and Spanish colonial revival are in many ways California styles, and you may or may not want any of that, coming in. But we think that a house like this, and I'll show you a diagram of this in a minute, but this provides a way to provide a low, wide house that sits just gently in the green landscape and connects the interior spaces of the home to the site in ways that the big estates just never did. The big estates, you're sort of up, surveying your domain, as opposed to living sort of right down in it. And some of these contemporary and mid-century modern houses, and the mid-century houses you already have, just open right out into the yard, which is a beautiful thing. So the new massing guidelines, we think, the current ones just identify these 3 basic schemes that you know well, and I won't go through them, and describe how they can be scaled up and scaled down, and it describes how to put them in the middle of the lot, but it doesn't talk about the relationship of how big the facade is compared to the roof. We need to add that. Because in the colonial houses or neoclassical, almost always the facade is essentially 2 square areas with the entry between them. And we can just mention that tie-in between the massing and styles. Now, that doesn't mean you couldn't have a colonial with the door off center, but just in terms of the starting point, we can define the ranges for the proportions of the facades and the ratios of the proportions to the roof. And it turns out that if you just look at the fields that are created on the fronts of these houses, even the Tudors generally have squarish areas of the facade and organize a wide house into 3 or 4 clearly defined, sort of fields on the front of the house rather than just stuff. And in all cases, it's the roof that holds things together. And I think a lot of the problems happen when you have so many things in front that you just can't even really see the main roof. And that applies to one-story houses, except the flat roof ones, which is another story. But I mean, houses don't have to have visible roofs. But if you're going to do a style with roofs, then let's see some of it. Because what makes some of these very complicated Tudors work so beautifully is that big slate roof can be seen in between all these things that are jumping up. And it holds it together so that it doesn't just turn into a zoo of things. And most of these styles, except the horizontal, more modern, verticality is a very important, the upward motion of the eye is key. And so you don't want so much stuff that your eyes just doesn't know where to look. So so these are illustrations we already have in the book. But, in each case, the main mass includes a facade that's made in certain ways and a roof that's proportioned in certain ways. And we can just define those as numbers and proportions in the guidelines. So if you're going to do that, here's the range of proportions you need to be looking at. So it doesn't get too tall or too short, and doesn't get too much hat on too small of a creature. We can also describe that these 2 stories with the scaled down is 2 stories with 1 low wing. The prototypical is 2 stories with 2 low wings, and scaled up is usually 2.5 story with bigger wings. But the wings are still got to be noticeably shorter than the main mass, otherwise you just got a house that's too damn big. And a lot of these proportional relationships cross over between styles. The basic 2 panels with the entry and the roof works for colonial. It works for neoclassical. It works for Mediterranean, except with Mediterranean, which leans toward the picturesque. You get a couple other verticals that are chimneys, but there's a calmness about this. The chimneys aren't screaming, "Hey, look at me, I'm a chimney." They're just gracefully sculpted out of the same material as the wall, and the roof is articulated, but subtly so. So it's basically it's a big box, and it's beautifully articulated. So we think the guidelines should say, so this is just our suggestions so the gray is what they already say, and we think you could add the orange, no more than 3 times the facade height, and the main mass is 50 feet, can be 50% of the width, but no more than 40 feet deep. We already say that one place, but I think there's certain cases where that could be bent, we think, and we could add those. The height limit now is 2.5 story or 35 feet, but it doesn't say anything about the height of the facade. So we think perhaps on the styles that aren't, on the long, low ones, some of the facades are like 8.5, 9 feet tall. That's fine. But if you're doing one of the vertical styles, then just don't make it less than, say, 12 feet, but not more than 24 on the facade. So we're not saying those are the magic numbers, but we can add numbers like that we think will make it simpler to get it right. And roof not taller than the facade. And in some cases, then we need to define the difference between a pediment and a dormer. This is a really interesting building. And ambiguity is sometimes what a very skillful designer will design things that you say, well, is that a dormer or is that a pediment? And the fact is, it's so beautiful, like you really don't care which. It just looks good. But we can improve some definitions, so at least you know what you're talking about. So if you decide maybe that's too big for a dormer, but it's not too big for a pediment, and it looks pretty much like a pediment, so go for it. And then on the picturesque guys, you've got the main mass, and the roof in that case is pretty much exactly the same height as the facade below. But if you drop that roof down a whole story, it would be too low. Well, on the left there, this is back to the ambiguity subject. Over here you say, oh crap, that roof is much taller than the facade. But because you've got this half-timbered extension of the main facade up, and the same thing happens with dormers on a lot of the 1.5 story houses in the south part of town. You'll have a low house with a big roof, but it's got beautiful dormers in strategic locations, which effectively pulls up the building's socks, so to speak. So all of a sudden, it's not a 1-story house; it's a 1.5 story house, and it works. But if those half-timbered pieces weren't there, that's probably too much roof. But they are there because that's part of the style, so it works. So we can just describe those subtleties more. I think we can put some more specific guidelines for Tudor and picturesque because it's hard to do right. And we can provide a little more help with getting it right, we think. So these major projections, okay, again, I showed you this before. You've got a big mass, but it's broken by that. Now, would 2 of those big gables on the front be appropriate on a house that wide? Probably not. Would 3? You got to be kidding. So just, we can add numerical criteria and the rationale for deciding. And so you've got these major pieces, but it's the roof that holds it all together. And the result, squares, there's actually some guidelines that we adapted from some colleagues of ours in Florida that started some of the best guidelines in form-based development standard. Well, they sort of started the whole industry about 30 years ago. And they had a term in their guidelines, which we've adopted. We don't use it in all of them, but it says that the openings should be no more squat than square. In other words, square or vertical, not horizontal. And so that applies, for instance, in Tudor, and where you have a horizontal window area in Tudor, it's divided into multiple vertical ones with heavy posts or stone columns that are in between. So basically, you're keeping the window proportions are going vertical. You're not getting ribbon windows in a Tudor house, which would just look, ridiculous. And the same thing goes for the facade pieces. In general, having them be either square or vertical rather than horizontal, except in the horizontal styles. And we need to differentiate that. So we're not mushing them together. I think that can be made clearer. Oh, and on the Tudor, asymmetry is the key. If you're going to have that kind of a big gable on a Tudor house, you don't have it right in the middle, and you don't have 2 of them just symmetrically with the door in between. The idea of that romantic style was asymmetry. And then you can do the same thing at a smaller scale. Oh, and another thing here that's important to note. You see, you've got all this verticality. You've got all this verticality going on. You've got the chimney is not shy about being vertical. The brick gable on the right there is not shy about being vertical. Clearly, one of the main ideas of this half-timbered element over the front door is to go vertical. But you've also got this strong line at the base of the half-timbering. It's sort of like the belt that holds all these pieces together. So up top, you've got the roof that's carrying through and holding all the vertical pieces together. And then here, in a very subtle, deft way, you've got this horizontal that's holding them together. And some of the houses that we've been looking at recently just don't have that kind of continuity. They got 3 or 4 or 5 vertical things, but there's no horizontal thread, either the roof nor any other architectural element at the base of the second floor that's sort of tying them together. So they just look like a bunch of pieces that aren't unified into a house. Okay. So, and in the same way we can characterize that on the smaller ones, you just one front gable, that's it. And then at what threshold are 2 front gables, as long as they're not symmetrical, okay. And under what circumstances, if any, well, down here. You got 3, and it works. And so why does it work? Well, we can quantify that in terms of proportions and dimensions and put some guidelines in there to help you come to terms with the applicants. And then at the 1-story scale, again, we've showed these, but we haven't described what makes them work. So you've got just straight up 1-story here. It's just nothing else except a 1-story house. And it's simple, and it's low, and it's not screaming, hey, look at me. It's just being a quiet house sitting there in its beautiful lot. Then in the middle here, you've got the 1.5-story thing going on. That roof would be, borderline, like maybe a little more roof than these walls wanted. But with these lovely dormers there, it, again, lifts the scale to be sort of a 1.5-story, and it articulates the otherwise plain roof plane. And then when you get to the scaled up, you get into this, what we'd call a 1.5, so we call this middle one maybe 1-story plus, but on the right, it's a legit 1.5-story colonial, which the interesting thing about that, in our opinion, is that the scaled up horizontal massing becomes basically the same as a scaled down central vertical massing. And on the truly horizontal houses, the whole idea of a main mass becomes maybe not terribly important or helpful. You know, it's like, well, where is the main mass? Well, that's not what we're talking about here. It's a horizontal house. It's not a squished down estate. It's what it is, and we can define more clearly the logic of just the purely horizontal mid-century houses. Speaking of which, I mean, how simple and beautiful is that? It's just it's a gable and a modified gable element, flanking a beautiful porch, hooked together by a simple roof. It's just, you know, speaking of understated elegance, it's just a lovely, simple, beautiful house. And it's connected to its lot in ways that the ones that are, you know, the estates aren't. This one, I was just going through our archives of hundreds and hundreds of photos, and I found this is sort of basically a split-level prairie-style house with a prairie-type roof projection and window detailing. It's got one piece that starts to be 1.5 sort of stories, asymmetrically disposed. You've got the lower wing to the right with these beautiful reinterpretations of bay, sort of prairie-style bay windows on them, and then just the simple, not very tall roofs tying it all together. And in this particular composition, what's at the intersection of these different moves is the entry. You know, how logical is that? So, you know, that's no relative of any of the classic Mission Hill styles, but it works beautifully, and it's made of fine materials. And it's just sitting there in its green lot looking like a nice house. So why not have more of those? And on the other hand, of what not to have more of, then I just pulled a lot of these off the internet. So this is just a house of many gables that, you know, this, I don't know, I think this came out of one of the sites that when I do Google searches for images, I get these sites where you can buy the plans. So somebody's selling the plans, and which is a good, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. But they just have put, you know, more stuff on the front here to make it look fancier. So it's not really a style, and it's not really a massing. So how do you? But if you're going to adapt, if you're going to make one-story houses, you look at the two-story house. You go with a two-story style and look at previous decades. That style has been rendered as a smaller house. This is, you know, Cape Cod colonial. Well, that's that's colonial. I mean, actually, that's where colonial started, just not to put too fine a point upon it, because it was a colony. They were colonies. And as I mentioned before, the one-story houses, the one-story houses of Mission Hills were in many ways just a simplified, this is basically colonial detailing on a little one-story ranch house, and it's beautiful. And then you're getting some new ones that are just confused. And so here you've got a big roof on a low building. I'm going to show you an animated slide in a minute with, is that a side wing or a rear wing or what is that thing on the back? And we understand that this has generated a bit of, and is that a brick cantilever? I mean, anybody know how to cantilever brick? Anyway. So we just diagrammed this. So the roof is big, and I guess it looks like that dormer got taken off because it's not on the house that's already partly built. But it's a big roof on a low house, and then the low house is made even lower because you got this masonry base thing that's sort of cutting it off at the knees. So the roof was way more than, way taller than the house, but now it's like 3 times taller than the facade that's left after you put this base thing on it. So anyway, and then this back wing thing. So it's just complicated and not in a good way. And it was the designer said they were basing the design on this. Well, that's a lovely building. Now there's two things. One is that's not what they're doing with that house. You know, if you're going to show an example of what you're doing, then, you know, how about you do that? And on the other hand, is this what the front of a house in Mission Hills ought to look like? I don't know, you be the judge. I think it's a beautiful house. Would I live in it? You know, if it was in the right place, yes, sure as heck I would, but not the other one. So here's another example of a. So this is part of the process thing. So the site plan without those colored outlines was what we were sent, and the site plan just showed the footprint. So well, there's the house. Well, where's the main mass? Well, who knows? So we tried to diagram with colors over it. You know, so what was the theory going on here of massing? So the main house is 40 feet deep, and so if your house is 40 feet deep and you got a 12-12 pitch, that's a 20-foot tall roof. So that better be on a 20-foot tall facade, but no, it's not. It's on a 8-foot or 9-foot tall facade, and that's the one I showed before. That's just, you know, a whole lot of roof, and the chimney is like 5 times taller than the front door. Well, that by itself isn't a problem. So are they on the Tudors, but this is not a Tudor. And the the pieces of, you know, the composition of that, that's nice. You know, that's a nice entry, that's a nice gable, that's a nice subtle bay sticking out from the gable. But there's just too many of them going on. And the fact that, and the one thing you never do with this picturesque style is do a matching one over here. You know, so that's, you know, mistake number 2. So then complex massing is, so this is one of the big square houses. And so I was just diagramming over it and saying, well, wouldn't it be nice if this had been conceived of with that big rectangle at the bottom being the main mass and those 2 other things being wings? And then if you have to have a plan that's that deep, you could have a flat roof area in the middle where nobody can see it, rather than just making the roofs keep going up, 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 till it be, because when we were doing the guidelines the first time, we said some of these houses, not so much in Mission Hills, but some of the examples of what we were described to us as the South Johnson County houses to avoid. It just looks like you took a tract house and hooked a bicycle pump up to it and just, you know, and then it's a big one. Well, that isn't how you make a Mission Hills house. You have to purposefully make the main house and then do the additional pieces if it's going to be that big. And if you can't stop yourself from having a deep plan, you could just put a flat roof in there, and this could be a ring with a wing with a ridge. This could be a wing with a ridge. This could be a ridge or a hip. But now it's got all these different pieces on top of it. You know, sort of it's just very complicated. Now, it's not the worst house, for sure. I mean, it's nicely made. The firm that designed this has done a lot of very good houses, but we just think there's too much going on. There's more going on than's necessary, and especially around the side here. I just took pictures of this today that I haven't had time to put in the presentation yet, but this massing on the side just gets very complicated and looks funny compared to the simpler house next door. And there's just so many pieces and parts. It just becomes too complicated and muddy, in our opinion. And then speaking of complicated, you've got this one that is just putting too many pieces on the front of a one-story house. Without those pieces, the roof would look too big, and with those pieces, we just think it looks confused. So, you know, if that's the main mass, is that a wing or a second main mass? Or if, following the logic of the original Tudors, if this was a big Tudor house, nobody would care if that was one roof or 2, because you'd have one of these big gables breaking it. But these three gables are almost the same as each other. And then you've got this other thing that's stylistically just from another planet, just plunked down in as a front entry. It's like, really? You know, if there were a large gable over here, and its little brother was over here, which is sort of what's going on, and then if its little brother was the porch, that'd work. But there's just, you know, too many things, and we think we can quantify that. And here again, you've got the main mass. Now the wings are exactly the same height, shape, size as the main house, and there's 3 of them just all in a row. And you've got those aren't courtyards. They're just little gaps with plants in them, which we think it basically just sort of hides the house. You can't, and you, in perspective, you can't see the roof tying it all together. It's just these 3 things. sitting there. We think that can be avoided. Then one-story houses, they typically have, most of them have one gable element or hip element at one end. Some of them have two, and what they all have is the roof. Many of them have the simple colonial detailing with the shutters, beautiful. In this case, the facade is 6 times as wide as it is tall. Well, that's why we say in these one-story mid-century houses, it's really not so much about the facade proportion, and it's not about, well, it is about not having, it certainly is about not having the roof, go up to here. But it's about just simplicity and calmness, and it works beautifully, because the roof just carries through, and it's just simple and just sits there in the green landscape and looks nice. Then if you want to make a one-story house out of colonial, there's a lot of ways to do that. You can still have the central piece with the classical columns that are so characteristic. Now that's characteristic of colonial sort of, south of the Mason-Dixon line, whereas in New England, they don't have classical columns on them. And either one would be okay in our opinion. If somebody wanted to do more of a colonial without the neoclassical porch on it, sure. And if you want to do it with a neoclassical porch, we saw a really interesting one today that I hadn't seen before that doesn't have classically correct columns on it, but their columns are square. They're about 12 inches square. They don't have the classical Doric or Ionic caps on them, but they just have simple, but they do have capitals and bases. Perfect. So that's a good example of adaptive. I wish I had a picture, but it didn't load fast enough. Here's a 1.5-story colonial with a big roof, but it's not too big because you've got the dormers that make it a 1.5-story. Completely charming, in my opinion. And if it needed to be bigger, it'd be a piece of cake to have another wing coming over here. You could have a back wing going back if you needed more bedrooms. So that's, colonial in an asymmetrical, non-2-story form, beautiful. I mean, this is not, there's another one. This is not a new trick. It's just, we can help steer, we can, I think in the process, you can require the applicant to identify the precedents that they're adapting. So make sure that the precedent they're adapting is already a strong house. Same with neoclassical. Easy peasy. And by the way, is that neoclassical or is that colonial? Well, not sure, and who cares? Because those kind of merge together, because if you put enough neoclassical porch action and a pediment on what's basically a colonial house with the tall windows and the shutters, that's already... Another interesting thing about the adaptive styles is all the houses in Mission Hills, basically all the houses in America are adaptive, because they're all based on 400-year-old estates in England, France, Spain, Italy. So the original Mission Hills houses are adaptations of earlier styles. So it continues, and we're paying it forward. But we need to make sure we're looking at fine examples of a style and then adapting that, rather than just taking pieces and parts from a bunch of houses. Well, there's a tradition of storybook houses. Actually, in Southern California, there were more set decorators per square inch in Los Angeles than anywhere on the planet. And a lot of them started doing these sort of fantasy storybook houses where they do little one-story, fairy tale storybook cottages that look like they were out of Hansel and Gretel. So there's that storybook tradition. What we're seeing now, I would refer to as the scrapbook tradition, where the couple comes in. They've been, or maybe Pinterest houses, right? It's one thing to find examples of stuff you like on Pinterest, but you can't just put everything you found on Pinterest in one house and expect it to fit in Mission Hills. So, keeping it simple and sticking to one style per house, and don't put every idea you ever liked on one house. And you all, your staff and you all are the gatekeepers to make sure that doesn't get inflicted on Mission Hills. Another one-story neoclassical without a roof. Now, I don't know where that is. very likely in California. But on the other hand, you know, that's a strong, one-story, simple, authentic, neoclassical, romantic with all the ivy on the walls. You know, would you turn that down in the right context? You know, probably not. Does that fit the rules for the big two-story houses? Nope. So I think we need to make some new rules for one-story houses. And the clarity of entry and the strong symmetry is very important in neoclassical, where it's anathema in the Gothic and Tudor traditions. And so if you're going to adapt this central vertical massing, you know, have a central vertical mass and have a massing scheme from the get-go. Come into your first review showing, okay, here's the massing. And if it's a one-story house, the rules will be different, and you don't have to show where the main mass is because we don't care. But if you're doing a taller house, you got to show your work, and not just load the front up with stuff. You know, we got to be able to see the simplicity has to read through all the pieces, more like that. Here's an idea, and this may generate controversy, which would be great. Or conversation. We don't have something to sell you here. We're just throwing out ideas, hoping that some of them are helpful. If you want to make a big house on a big lot, and you want a style that has a lot of verticality to it, one strategy is to essentially have multiple gently connected wings that could actually just be connected by little dog run connector piece, little hallways. Because if you want to really feel like you're living in the site, if you want a strong relationship between every time you're moving through the house, you're seeing the gardens and the decks and stuff. You can. This is a beautiful example. We think this is in near Savannah, Georgia. So it's a different tradition, but it's a big house that's composed of sort of like three smaller houses that are connected. And you've got some examples of that going on here, and we think it can be fine. So then, here's how that house connects to its backyard. It just opens up and just gives the backyard a big hug, which is a pretty nice thing. This is recently proposed here in Mission Hills. So remember I told you can't do a horizontal house in Tudor? You know, I lied. Because if you can't do a house that's you shouldn't do a house that's that wide and just put more and more Tudor thingies on it. But I think this is quite artful. If you have these sort of connector pieces, they're almost like cloisters, you know, connecting between multiple buildings. So it becomes what we would call is sort of a compound pattern, which actually many of the grandest estates, traditional and newer, throughout the country, if you look at the Hamptons, you look at Newport, you look at Beverly Hills and Palm Springs and Mission Hills. You can find places where if the lot's big enough and you're not pushing the house too close to the neighbors, you can organize pieces of a more vertical, small, you know, modest-sized pieces of a vertical style in a picturesque way within the lot and start to define gardens and courts. Hamptons, Montecito. That's a suburb of Santa Barbara that's comparable to Mission Hills in many ways. A lot of movie stars live there in the houses, you know, start at 10 million. And the other thing is, there's some really great architects all around the country. This is a good friend of ours named Michael Imber. Some of you may remember Anne McGlone, who worked with us on the original guidelines, advising us on architectural style. I met her and Michael at the same time when we were working in San Antonio years ago. And this is a large ranch, but he's designed this house as sort of a series of separate structures that define courtyards. So this is the entry as you come in, built out of just fine Texas limestone. And then it's organized around courtyards like that. Well, you know, that's a pretty nice way to live. And it's a way to take a really big house and make it into, you know, a series of smaller, lower pieces so that it doesn't look like a tract house with a lot of pieces glued onto the front, and that it doesn't just puff up and look like a house that's too big. So we could include some provisions for that. And then adaptive styles. You know, starting with a simple sketch. I cheated here. This is a sketch by George Washington Smith. He was so Santa Barbara Spanish colonial revival architecture is pretty famous, and George Washington Smith did it probably better than anybody. He designed a lot of the estates in Montecito. So just a simple massing sketch. Okay, I see the main house, I see the wing, yeah, got it. Or come in even with something like the drawings we made that just come in with a simple massing model of your lot. Say, okay, here's the massing scheme for this, and here's the style we want to do it in, and get that clarified before you've spent $60,000 on and got the couple's heart all set on exactly how big each closet is, and then require at that initial meeting that they identify the style they're going to adapt. If they say Greek Revival, then pick a good one. And require that the precedent they're starting from be something that everybody agrees is a strong house, and then if you're a skillful architect, you can mess around with it and adapt it. And recognize that contemporary or modern designs just follow different rules. This one, we were looking at a house in Mission Hills, actually the one next door to Kevin. What streets? Belinder. Okay, right. So the logic of modern architecture, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a minute when we chat, but it's a balance of horizontal and vertical, but it's an entirely different vocabulary. These are not masses so much as they are volumes or spaces, and the horizontals and the verticals aren't a whole ground floor, but it's this beautiful wall around that defines this entry court. So you've got a horizontal roof supported by one post, and this is a beautiful outdoor room through which you enter the house. You see these strong, the strong verticals and strong horizontals. They're balanced, but in a very dynamic way. It's a more abstract, well, it's like modern painting is to traditional landscape paintings, right? They just abstracted them in different ways and achieve a balanced composition, but in a completely different, more dynamic, balanced technique than the more static big house with the big things next to it. And it's a perfectly honorable tradition. It's hard to do well, but, well, all of this is hard to do well. And then, by the way, when you're adapting styles, remember that each of the styles that you consider, there's Mission Hills colonial, but then there's, colonial. I mean, they were doing this in Massachusetts in, 1690. And so if somebody wants to do a stripped down or a reinterpreted colonial, well, that's been done before. In fact, that was done before the fancy stuff. So just go back and look at that, and adapt that. Or if you want to adapt Greek Revival, how about you adapt that? And by the way, French has been, a tricky thing sometimes here. They get these funny roofs that aren't, well, the roofs with a flare on them and the big dormer windows and stuff. But there's very beautiful examples of how the French style has been reinterpreted in an asymmetrical, picturesque way. This is almost like a merger of some French elements with more of the asymmetrical Tudor massing style. It works. But I think in the process, the architect would need to say, okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to do this tall two-story house. We're going to have asymmetrical massing, but my client doesn't like Tudor. They like French. So here's an example of how you can do that same. A lot of these moves, a lot of these moves are very, very much like the Tudor. I mean, that's very Tudorish, but it's not Tudor. Or if you want to do a small Tudor house, well, there's a lot of examples of how to do that well. And back to that compound example, if you wanted to do this with a couple of its little brothers next door with connectors, that could be fine too. But if you're just going to try to do this, for 100 feet wide, that's going to be too much. And mid-century modern is the intersection of two styles. We've already defined mid-century. We've already defined modern. There are not very many modern houses in Mission Hills. There's a few more now and some good ones. But mid-century modern was a fusion of the two, and it wasn't so much it wasn't so popular in this part of the country, but we think it could provide a good way for people to have horizontal houses that have strong, strong connections from the indoor space to the outdoor space that sit quietly under all the trees instead of making something that says, hey, look at me, look at me. It's more about the space than it is about the object. So now I'm going to just show you a series of things. And how are we doing on time? I don't want to go forever here. It's 3:15. Okay, so we're, okay, fine. So one thing we've noticed is that you're getting these houses that are sort of set up on plinths. Now there's such, here you've got a house on a sloping site with a strong stone base that basically just, the strong stone house just continues down. And this is just deft. So we didn't, obviously this isn't a new house and they aren't listening to me when they're designing it. I mean, I'm just learning from what they did. So here at the low end of the site where the house is tallest, as it turns out, the height of the facade and the height of the roof are pretty much the same. And then as it slopes up the hill, oh shoot, I'm sorry, excuse me. Just organically, over here, as it slopes up the hill, the facade is not quite so tall because the ground's coming up, and the roof is less tall because they deftly articulated it. So they're sort of keeping the ratio of more facade than roof, but it's in a dynamic way on a sloping site, as opposed to, in this case, this design has graded. I drew the red line, but it's pretty obvious that grading is involved here. So they're making a flat pad for a house that's designed to go on a flat site. Well, this is not a flat site. And then, oh, and the roof is twice as tall as the facade that it's sitting on, which we don't think is a very good thing. And yeah, they do have some dormers. You could argue about that, but that roof, even with the dormers, that roof is pretty damn tall. So you could just you don't have to have that steep of a roof pitch on this, because, you know, is this Tudor? No, it's not. So what are we doing with the 12-12 or 13-12 pitch? Except making a really big roof. And then when they had an opportunity at this corner to just go ahead and let this corner be tall, like that beautiful Tudor we saw a minute ago, they just decided to make this whole sort of stone base and then park a house that was designed for a flat site on this base. And this base, one of the things we put in the original guidelines is that any site elements, walls, etc., should either look like they're part of the house or they're part of the landscape. You know, if you have a wall going out into the landscape, it should either sort of match the house and looks like it's an extension of the house architecture that's going out into the green space, or it could be rocks and, you know, rustic rocks or clinker bricks or something that just looks like it's part of the garden. In this case, you've got this piece here that, well, it doesn't quite look like the house, but it definitely doesn't look like the garden. So it kind of disconnects the house from the site, in our opinion. We think that should be avoided. I mean, here's another example of this. So many Tudors in this town are just unbelievable. So this is another sloping site. Look how this wall. Did they draw a line here and put a different material here? No. They just took the same beautiful stone and just kept going down. And so the houses should just set right down on the ground. They shouldn't be propped up on a thing, in our opinion. So here, again, you've got, okay, so then the guideline, okay. Does that notion about the plinth seem like something worth putting in the guidelines, or am I missing something important there? I'm not here to sell you things. I speak so emphatically, but I'm asking questions. I'm not telling you what to do.
Could you repeat your question?
Well, so do you think that the? I'm so sorry. So now I'm going to remind myself to ask the question at the right moment. Do you think that kind of a plinth with the house set down on it is something to be careful with or to try to avoid, or? Does that generally seem like something that the guidelines should accomplish?
The issue you have with that is that's a common foundation detail here, because that's a concrete foundation.
Yes.
If we don't do the, if we don't do the stone or something like that on it, what would you suggest putting on that material?
Oh.
So it's not just exposed concrete.
Well, I think what I'm talking about is something it's subtler than that. To my eye, well, there's certainly ways of doing, well, I mean, look at all the Tudors. There's, and the stick and shingle style, you know, from hundreds of years. There's certainly ways of doing masonry bases and wood houses. This just seems like a clumsy job of it to me. It just looks like you had a house that was designed for a flat site, and you made sort of a stone base and set on it. But
so the issue isn't the fact that it's a stone foundation.
Correct.
The issue is the way they detail the stone foundation.
Yes, sir. And I think that's running through a lot of this. It's not that there's anything wrong with having the bottom of a house stone. There's sure as hell nothing wrong with having the top be shingles. But it's the way that they're integrated and articulated. And the most deft of the classical houses, especially the Tudor picturesque, is the weaving together. You've got those strong wooden horizontals. You've got the vertical roofs. You've got the half timbering, and you've got material. Everything's woven and integrated as opposed to just sort of being set down on top of. That's really what we're talking about. So does that seem generally like an okay point to? Okay, we'll go.
Can't you say that you want the house to recognize the lot?
Yes.
The Tudor subsequent to this, like sloping down, recognizes the lot. This denies it.
Yes. Well, right, because the back, well, the half that's farthest away from the camera here is cut into the dirt, and this is propped up on a stone thing, as opposed to having. And we deal with this all the time, especially in California, where there's so many terrible houses being built, where they just go up a hillside site and they bench it off. They cut flat spots and put flatland houses. But the hallmark, we think, of fine homes, like every home in Mission Hills should be, is that it doesn't make the terrain conform to it. It conforms to the terrain. And it gracefully sits on the green site, rather than making a flat place to set itself down. That's it. Wait, what? Oh, there we go. Okay. So this is just an amazing example of how to not do that. Okay, so then we think, do you generally agree that having some guidelines about, for the two-story classic styles, having some proportional guidance about the width of the facade to the height of the facade, perhaps some dimensional criteria for how high the facade should be, and something about how much shorter than the main mast the wings should be, and if they're set back, you know, by at least how much, and then criteria for the wings. How differentiate, more precise criteria differentiating the wings from the main mast, and we can add some of those criteria into guidelines for this massing type, and some of those into the guidelines for individual styles. Does that basically just connect? All the dots are already there. We can just connect them better, we think. Does that seem? And not to just dictate, you got to design the house like this, but to define parameters. And we think in most cases, rather than, well, in some cases you just need dimensions. But in a lot of cases it's really proportions. You want to leave flexibility, but it just can't be more than this, you know, it can't be more than 3 times the width that it is the height. And the openings should be square or vertical, not horizontal, unless you're in a horizontal style. Yes, ma'am.
Oh. Is it on? On the Architectural Review Board, we're seeing more contemporary homes.
Yes.
And I think we could use, residents who choose contemporary, they could use more guidance, because we're doing a lot of work on vertical lines, on how much goes above that, strong vertical line, and then you still have a higher roof line, and it's very puzzling to us.
We agree.
And I think that could really help, because we're going to see more and more of that come in front of us. Then the other question is, we're getting architects that are now describing a style as transitional. Can you speak to that?
Well, that's kind of like contemporary. It's like whatever you say it is. It's like, well, what's that? Well, that's transitional. Yeah, that's what it is, transitional. Well, no, okay. No, but
Okay,
that's
so
the
two-
silly answer.
The
But
two homes you used today as examples of what not to do, and we lowered the roof probably 30 feet on one of them, is the one, the concept was a Belgian stone farmhouse.
well, right, and that was a nice farmhouse.
It was. So that was presented to us as transitional, something between contemporary and traditional. And the other one is the one with the three,
Yeah.
that was also presented as a transitional.
Well, okay, I think we just have to define some things. There's nothing wrong with transitioning. I mean, nobody, we're certainly not saying that everybody should just copy what J.C. Nichols did exactly. Or not every house has to look like it was built 200 years ago, for sure. But that's where I think we need some more descriptive guidance on proportions. And we as Bill pointed out when we were chatting earlier, I think we so admire the classic mission, the classic colonial and Tudor and neoclassical house, the big estate houses, that I think we accidentally let too much of the guidance about those sort of filter into direction for the long, low houses. I don't think we recognized clearly enough the strengths and the differences that the horizontal and contemporary houses have, and I think we can describe that much more clearly.
David, I think what Gail is saying is really important. You recognize that the contemporary styles, we kind of missed. Thank you. We kind of missed in 2020, and now we're catching up to speed on contemporary. Yep. But Gail is spot on. It looks like this transitional thing is evolving ahead of us, and I think my observation of the ARB is we really do need some help on how that's evolving, if this is going to be more than just a 2-year or 4-year transformation of the guidelines.
But whatever you call it, see, we've been chatting, as we chatted with Jill, we're hearing about adaptive styles. They're saying it's an adaptation of blah, blah, blah. Well, everything's, as I said earlier, everything in Mission Hills is an adaptation of something. And they were just really good adaptations of amazing houses. But we think that the contemporary style, as we defined it, or as we didn't really define it much, and the mid-century style, as we didn't really define it much, are really the same thing. They're adaptive. They're transitional. They're an adaptation of some elements of the traditional styles and a merger of them with more modern horizontal sensibilities. I wouldn't grant transitional the dignity of calling it a thing. I would just say it's another version of contemporary and adaptive. I mean, I think they're like 3 shades of gray. They're not another color. And I think when you say, well, that's not an adaptation, no, it's transitional. Basically, it's taking certain classic characteristics of houses that have been well received in Mission Hills and just messing around with them. But how you mess around with them matters a lot. And some of them there's just too much stuff. And a lot of it's just the detailing isn't good. The proportions are just awkward. And so I think we need to add, we can say some things about proportions and detailing that we didn't, And we can key that to styles, because we have the section on just general, how you detail walls, how you detail columns, how you detail bay windows, etc. But you do it differently for different styles, and I think we can add some of that in. And I think the adaptation and the transition thing is really a lot about process. What you cite as that which you are transitioning from, and how you document that, and how I think the combination of process and detail and proportion will help a lot. I mean, this is never going to be easy. You know, architecture is complicated, and if we could make a book that made all the buildings look good, we'd be really, really rich. But you know, there's no amount of guidelines is going to make an architect who's just not very talented suddenly draw a nice house. So I mean, in some cases, the solution may end up being they just need to hire another architect. Now, I'm not speaking about any particular architects, and a lot of these houses are done by local firms who we know can do really good architecture. But sometimes it's just not the right fit. You got an architect trying to do a style they just don't know how to do.
And I think sometimes they just say traditional because they don't really have a style to their house.
Right.
So they throw out that term transitional so that we don't have to pin them down on a certain style.
Right.
They just say, well, it's transitional, and they think that will be covered.
And it sounds better than scrapbook.
I've got one more question.
Oh, yes, sir.
Are you working on the guidelines for ancillary improvements like pools, pool houses, gazebos, sport courts? Is that part of things that you're tidying up on your guidelines?
That's not part of this contract, no.
Okay.
But if it was important, we could probably make it part of our contract.
We could look into that, yeah.
Okay.
Because
I think it impacts. I mean, if you get the house sitting properly on the site, but then you have all these other things that are around, it starts to detract from, or can detract from what you're trying to achieve with the house massing.
we agree. Well, we can talk about that with staff, because, I mean, yes, ma'am.
I just want to also clarify, it sounds like you're exclusively talking about new construction.
Or major remodels for sure. Yeah, substantial construction. You've got different definitions, but if somebody is going to like remodel the house or put a new face on an old house, then I think these guidelines would apply, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right, because I do think when you are doing a major renovation, that it's also a lot easier to call it adaptive or transitional because you're not starting from the ground up.
Right, right. And if you right. That's a complicated issue too, because the Secretary of the Interior standards for historic structures say that if you're doing an addition to a historic landmark, the addition should be clearly distinct from the original. In other words, you shouldn't just try to completely match. Well, that's so what do? Do you put a glass box on an old Tudor house? Probably not. I'm sorry?
We have somebody that's actually want to do just that.
Well, yeah, I know. Okay. Anyway, but adaptive and contemporary and transitional don't mean anything by themselves. What they're all saying is that we're trying to keep some of the essential characteristics of what was here and do it differently.
So then you're having to define what your home is existing.
Yeah.
And what you aspire to do with the renovation, so that you're maintaining the integrity of your original.
And which characteristics of the style that which characteristics of the original style do you propose to retain as the thread, and which do you propose to alter, and generally in what way and to what end? You know, if they say if somebody wanted to do if somebody wanted a solarium or a winter garden, right? On the back of one of your historic houses, they wanted a glass room. Well, English estates have been doing that for 200 years, where you could just put a greenhouse with the same roof pitch on the back of a 200-year-old Tudor house. Well, that could be fine. Or if it was too big and too close to the neighbors, or caused them to be blinded by the reflections off the roof, that might not be good. So, but so what are you changing, and why are you changing it?
And so much of this, can you hear me?
Yes.
Over there?
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, sorry. So much of this is really emphasizing process and priorities. So I think with regard to, so one of the recommendations that we've made with regard to architectural style and massing is in the design review process that the applicant would be required to identify the essential characteristics of the style that they're proposing. So we're recommending creating a framework within the guidelines that will guide the categories under which they describe those essential characteristics, so that you're not just using terminology like transitional or adaptive to mean whatever you want it to mean, or to represent whatever your design happens to be, that you're describing the characteristics of your home with regard to its massing, its configuration, its materiality, and the appropriateness of those things to precedents of the style that you're purporting to replicate or adapt.
There's actually, I came up with a name for that style. Well, in the 80s, I was the chairman of the Architectural Review Board in this community I was in. That's actually what got me to switch from architecture to town planning. And it became clear to me in situations like this that people would just try to explain. They just drew what they drew because they liked the way it looked when they drew it. And then you ask them, what is that? And then they give you this long explanation. So at that time, the postmodernism was a well-known style. The idea of stylizing and modernizing traditional architecture. I coined the term post-rationalist architecture, where you'd just post-rationalize. Well, yeah, that's what we were doing. We were, it's Tudor, but it's French. Or, it's like, oh, come on. So just make them come in, basically, they got to get their story straight and then stick to it. Yeah, so as Peter said, and it was Jill and Peter keep reminding me, I'm all, the designing guy, but it's the process. It's how you organize the conversation, because you've got to be respectful of the person who bought the property. You've got to be respectful of their professional advisors. But I think the conversation can be guided in a direction that can be more productive and produce more predictable results. I think a lot of it'll just have to do with maybe an updated checklist. On a lot of these, we're seeing the spaces between. We're seeing horizontal windows with and the pieces between them are too thin. And anyway, there's ways of just describing the intent, and early on when you're reviewing an elevation, you got to make sure that space in between the windows is wide enough that if it was structural, it would actually hold up all that stone up above, as opposed to it just looking like it's just looking wrong.
The architects with their clients?
Oh, 100%. What I was mentioning to Bill last night in my years as the chairman of the Architectural Review Board, many times after we'd leave a contentious meeting where the architect and their client had been sitting there and we'd been giving them suggestions, and after the meeting was over and everybody'd left, the architect would sort of hang behind and approach me in the hallway in City Hall outside and say, thank you. I've been trying to explain that to them for 6 months, but they pay my fees, so I can't tell them that. Thank you for telling them that. No, absolutely. Yeah, you've got some very good architects who are working here, and they're getting scrapbooked.
Well, one thing we talked about was in the design review process, trying to get more information earlier in the process.
Yes.
So that we can have these really important discussions before they spend all the money and design it. Because, as he mentioned, right now we get some sort of a site plan just so we can make sure it meets the zoning regulation setbacks.
With just a footprint.
Yeah, with just a footprint. And then we'll get some sort of a rendering of the front so we can kind of see this architectural style, kind of not sometimes, but we can kind of see some of the massing. We don't get a roof plan. So it's really hard to pinpoint a lot of the guidelines and making sure they're meeting them at that point because we just don't have the information. So then their very next step is the extreme of we have done everything to go to the ARB. We have the survey done. We have all the elevations done. We have, I mean, just tons and tons of information. The streetscape of the whole street. We've surveyed other houses. And then they come to the PRP, and then we see all of it, and we're like, oh, no, this, you know, you're not meeting this, you're not meeting that. And then some of them are upset that they've spent all this money, and now they're going to have to go redesign. So we really want to start having those conversations earlier on in the process, requiring more information. So before they're heart set on it and they've spent all that money, we can get them to meet the guidelines and the zoning regulations.
Do we have consensus on that? Because that changes the process. And I think that's really fundamental. If we as a, I'm sorry. That changes the process, and I hope we've got consensus on that, because there will be pushback on that. It changes the role of the architect. It front loads some of the costs, but it saves them money on the backside. So is there anybody who doesn't agree with what Jill just said? I'd be interested in hearing that.
I'm not in disagreement, but I think we need to be cautious as we get younger residents who want to move in. I don't think they want to hear you can only build a Tudor, you can only build a colonial. You know, I think we need to be really cautious that we're not getting too black and white, and that they've got some leeway on adaptive styles. I think adaptive is a better, more descriptive word than transitional.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
So I think we need to be cautious. I don't want the reputation that we're only a colonial, we're only this or that, or we're gonna lose the market, and we're gonna lose the rejuvenation that's going on in the city.
Yeah, we're not remotely considering specifying that you have to do a particular style. And look, there's hundreds of adaptive houses, some of which are, you know, like 50 years old, already here. You know, you've got houses, you've got 1 and 1.5 story houses that have a lot of colonial detailing. Well, they're adaptive. They've just been here since the 50s or the 60s or the 70s, and they look great. So, I mean, this is not a new thing. It's just making sure the guidelines talk about it in clear ways, I think. Yeah, for sure, we're not saying everybody should have a 2-story house. We're not saying that it needs to be one of 4 styles. Absolutely not. And something as simple as just a dimensioned roof plan in the first meeting could save a whole lot of heartache, instead of just this black blob that's, you know, well, there's where the house is, and see it's not too close to the neighbors. Well, so, and that's to some extent our fault. Well, but responsibility. Because the way we set up the guidelines, we were so focused on keeping the houses from getting too close to the edges of the lot. We didn't add enough. Well, just requiring a dimensioned roof plan in the first review would do so much.
Just speaking from the BZA perspective, and not even as to these new thoughts that you have about how we can get a little more granular about some of the design. I still think the whole concept of having more upfront conversation about what expectations are in the city would help prevent a lot of the things we see, not all of them, but it would certainly, if people understood the process and had an early opportunity for the city to remind them why some things work and some things don't, so they don't get their heart set on them. And to Gail's point, I do think we have to be careful, because whether it be young residents or new residents, everybody comes in when they buy a house and think, well, here's what I'm going to do to that lot or that house or whatever. But, you know, we do need to find a way to force them into an early conversation so that we can get a few things out on the table about some of your massing issues or just the big overarching issues. Would avoid a lot of the pushback that ARB sees, that BZA sees, and so communication.
I'm so glad to hear you say that, because as you were saying that, I remembered that around 1987, when I was running the Architectural Review Board in my town, we recognize that exact same thing, and I talked the city council into requiring, for projects over a certain size, requiring a conceptual design review hearing. So before you're very far into it, you just got to bring us a site plan, a conceptual site plan, and some elevation sketches early, before you've spent $100,000 on plans for your shopping center or whatever. Yeah, and that's worked very well for decades in that town. And now they're screwing it up again, but I've moved on. You know, politics, you guys are really lucky here that your council is so focused on this subject. A lot of city councils lose their focus. I think so we don't have to go through. So, okay, this is just, we're saying the same kinds of characteristics could, regarding just more completely describing what makes the Tudor style work in terms of how many gables, how big, generally, you know, some of the proportional criteria. So I don't think the only question is, well, if you're up for having that additional clarity for the traditional central vertical massing of the big estates and lower adaptations of them, and for the grand picturesque estates and for further adaptations of them, we would just propose to add in additional clarity for the various styles. We already talked about this. I don't need to take your time with that. But we can add clarity into the picturesque massing type and clarity into the Tudor style guidance, just to make it clearer. And then if I think in the guidelines we can add we can beef up a little bit with your help and agreement the identification of the most essential characteristics of each of those styles, which then will provide a solid jumping off point for adapting them. So partly it's the architect and your staff and yourselves, well, the architect and your staff at those early meetings that are agreeing on what's most important, but we can put a bunch of that in the guidelines so that they don't have to do all their own research every time. They can just look in the guidelines and they can say, well, we disagree with that, and then you can talk about that. Basically just beef up a bit the definitions and the essential characteristics of the massing types and the styles. And some of its details, a lot of its details. For instance, on these kinds of windows, you've got the delicate pane structure within there, but then you've got much more solid, visible verticals here. Lately, you've been getting a lot of these black windows, and you get these huge things, and just unless you look really close, it just looks like a black aluminum storefront from a shopping center or something, and it looks horizontal. So you get these big sort of horizontal black holes in a stone building. Well, that just makes no visual sense. So I think we can add some clarity about how the verticals need to be big enough that if they were structural, they would hold up that heavy stone lintel over the top of the window rather than just having it magically floating there. And one of the things that holds this together is, see, you've got all these verticals going up, but those two windows are very similar to each other. So they provide a horizontal continuity in a very subtle way. So again, you're weaving, you're doing strong verticals and strong horizontals. All of these traditional styles do that. With the big wide houses with neoclassical columns, or the Tudor houses with the belt, sort of the horizontal elements we described before, and then the contemporary and mid-century do it in a different way. They have these strong stone piers, and then the strong horizontal roof fascias. It works fine, but it's in every case it's balance. Yes, sir.
Are you seeing Tudor houses being painted white in other parts of the country as well?
No. I mean, one guideline could be, let's think, don't do that. I mean, you know, sometimes, I mean, that's just silly. Well, I was telling Jill when we were driving around town, in my part of the country, in California, we make all kinds of terrible mistakes, and they're just different mistakes. But that's just crazy. And,
Well, we can't stop that, can we?
okay.
We don't regulate.
Yeah.
Okay, well then some homeowner in a few years that has a little bit of taste can just pay somebody a lot of money to scrape it off. Yeah, I get it that this British arts and crafts thing with the white houses with the black windows is a little bit of a thing, but it would be great if the people designing them understood anything about British arts and crafts. The Pinterest strikes again. Okay. Oh, we don't need that. I'm sorry. We can skip over this. Oh, okay. So then you've got the neoclassical, the classic neoclassical, similar proportions in all these cases with a strong entry and heavy masonry expression, sometimes with asymmetrical wings. We can describe that a bit more than we have so far in the style and the massing type. And then this is a different version of Mediterranean, where it's not really going to Spanish colonial, but it's going to more asymmetrical. It's not just a big square, it's not just a big rectangular house. It's going around corners in different and picturesque ways. But again, it's basically a sort of a squarish panel and a smaller wing element, vertical. So basically, again, square and vertical, not horizontal. I mean, the house is wide, but it's articulated into generally vertical pieces. And the windows are vertically proportioned. And because they're in a style that came from masonry, they have tall, thin windows, and they have arched windows because they were originally made out of stone, and the thing would fall down if the windows were wide, and in some cases if they weren't arched, and with beautifully articulated front entries. And arched windows with these supports, those may or may not be structural, but they look like if they were made out of stone, they would hold the building up, as opposed to being thin little, strips of stucco. And then the Spanish colonial, there's different versions of it. This is a house designed by George Washington Smith in Montecito. I didn't look it up on Zillow, but it's probably $15 million. Part of that's because it's in Montecito, of course. But it's Mediterranean, but it's asymmetrical composition. So in the same way that the Tudor depends on the picturesque, balanced asymmetry, this sort of style does too. Colonial would look really stupid if you didn't line the windows up. This style would look pretty silly if you did. So if you're looking for adaptations of the Mediterranean tradition, there's already well-defined ones that could be described or at least discussed. Also, there's a lot of ways to create asymmetrical, picturesque compositions on the front. Now, is this branch of the Mediterranean tree anything that you think has and it lends itself to more horizontal compositions than the big old heavy houses. But on the other hand, it might look like something that doesn't belong. Is that generally something that would be worth describing as a way to make Mediterranean houses one story, or not? I'm sorry? I'm sorry, I couldn't. And like all styles, it's easy to screw up, but it's also easy to, it's easy to do very simply. Oh, okay. I'll just unplug that instead of tripping over it again. That's my charger. It's already charged. And it frees. You can do asymmetrical compositions. You can do beautiful. You can do porches. You can do shutters or not shutters. You can do balconies. You can do picturesque sort of roof compositions. And anyway, it's basically there's so many versions of the styles there's so many branches of the styles you already have that just aren't here yet. And so rather than having somebody screw around with a classic Mediterranean and adapt it into some stucco box, they could, if they want to make it horizontal, there's, you know, this is not a new trick. This has already been invented. You know, there's another George Washington Smith version of Mediterranean that, you know, is a pretty fine thing with a big central house and then big wings. And, oh, and by the way, in this style, the wing doesn't necessarily have to be shorter than the main house, but it has to be set back a lot. And then you can have arcades that start defining areas within the yard. Same proportional things. You got two squarish things with the entry in the middle. And here's a more picturesque version with the porte cochere, where the car drives through to the backyard. So you're creating a low horizontal composition that I think has a lot of the same asymmetrical, picturesque characteristics of the Tudors, but it lends itself to being a lower house, whereas the Tudors are trickier to do if you want asymmetrical. Oh, and by the way, that's Oprah Winfrey's house. And so does that seem like something worth allowing or providing a little guidance on? And we're not here to sell Mediterranean. We were just seeing there's so many one-story houses that are suffering from people trying to make them into colonial and other styles. So, and okay, I think that's a better direction, personally. I think maybe we could provide a little guidance for this and a bunch more guidance for the mid-century contemporary.
So taking the mid-centuries and going contemporary, you're taking the colonial windows out and going much more horizontal windows and doors.
Well, if you're going to do horizontal, then go ahead and do horizontal. It's just when you're doing a vertical style and you put horizontal windows in it, it just looks dumb. Because how can you have a window that's 12 feet wide and 6 feet high and has stone on top of it? Well, you can do it with a few steel posts, but that's not architecture, that's structural engineering. Well, well, I think we're pretty much. I could finish in like 3 minutes, or we could just take a break now. Well, you're the mayor. Tell me. Do you want to take a break now?
Yes, break now.
Okay, good. Of course. Sure.
I'm watching people squirm in their chairs.
Oh, please.
And there's food and drinks over there?
Over there, yep. So 410. All right, we're going to have David wrap up. David, you ready to wrap up? So we'll have David wrap up, and then we have a couple of topics after that. And then what I failed to mention at the beginning was that you will see me slide out of here at 4:30 because Parents Weekend got scheduled after this got scheduled. So I'm going down to Parents Weekend in Dallas. It seemed dumb for all of you to have to reschedule this meeting for me. So that's not an indication of lack of passion on this topic. It's just better for all of you. So, David, it's all yours.
Okay, this. Oh, am I on? Okay, yeah. Well, there's very little left here. So the reason I was just chatting with Barbara, and she was noting that we're showing a bunch of pictures of houses that aren't in Mission Hills, and obviously our main focus is looking at what has worked well in Mission Hills and looking at what hasn't worked well in Mission Hills and then solving those problems, not other people's problems. But I brought in some images of other, because there's some styles that we have perceived, well, some of the one-story houses and some of the hybrid or non-traditional Mission Hills styles have proved difficult. And on the theory that simpler is better and classic is classic, if somebody's going to do, if somebody says they're going to do an adaptation or a transitional from French country, well, that's French country. It's in France and it's in the country, and that's where it started. It was just a stone farmhouse. And then later on, they got bigger and got ivy growing on them and got tall chimneys and the flared roof eaves, and they're rather lovely things. And then, it's a big roof, but it's still smaller than the facade, like we were mentioning. And then you get into the sort of the chateau look, and you've got a bunch of you've got several good examples that I just saw today for the first time of not that big, but where one of the key characteristics of this style is the wings get basically pyramidal and or hipped roofs that are not coming out of the main roof. They're separate from and located beside the main roof, and that can be a charming, sort of picturesque, it gives you a very interesting skyline. So that's a legit thing to do, but if you're going to do it, do it right. And here you've got, stone, you've got tall openings, you've got arches, you've got shutters that match the windows, you've got these beautiful dormers that pick up the geometry of the windows in the house. And then you've got the adaptation where, some builder this is one of those houses, I think you can buy the plans online, where, somebody just took abstracted that in sort of an overly busy way. But you can also do it in simple ways. If you want to adapt French, you can do it like that and make a porch. In that case, it's just got like 8x8 posts holding up a roof that's characteristic of the French style with a couple of dormers that are not exactly normal French. So now, you may or may not love that house, but that seems to me like a reasonable adaptation of some of the elements from French country. When we were doing the guidelines the first time, there were 2 or 3 or 4 houses that had been proposed either while we were preparing the guidelines or right after that claimed that they were doing French country that just looked kind of strange and like they didn't belong in Mission Hills. So if you're going to do a style, then there's ways to adapt most styles so they would go to look like they belong in Mission Hills, and usually it has a lot to do with making them simple. So does that? So if somebody tells you that they're doing a style that isn't common in Mission Hills, then we think one of the keys is for them to identify what's that style, and maybe we can have some clarity in the guidelines for a few styles about, okay, what are the essential character defining attributes of that style? And so then you can agree on which of those you're going to do just like the real thing, and which of those you're going to adapt, and how you're going to adapt them. Does that seem like a useful way to get at this transitional adaptation, whatever, contemporary reinterpretation?
How do you do that without getting into a much thicker style manual?
Well, I think right now we have just the appendix. It's just a short bullet points of here's the top 8 things that a Tudor house does. And maybe and that's just 2 pages per style. Maybe we do 4 pages per style, and maybe instead of 7 styles, we do 10.
So Gail, how does that?
I know it would be helpful to us, the committee. It has to be helpful to the residents coming in. And I want to just take that transition out of our language. I don't really think it's an architectural.
No, it's a wiggle word.
And draw it back to adaptation.
Yeah, I mean it's sort of like the word try. Try is kind of a baby word. I'm trying. Well, okay. I'm transitioning. Okay, let's just talk about what you're doing here.
And the critical piece there is identifying the criteria under which, or the topics under which the essential characteristics of any style are being documented and identified. And that has, of course, to do with massing, of course, to do with composition configuration, and of course, to do with materiality, and perhaps 1 or 2 other categories. But that's the framework that I mentioned previously that's going to be critical to creating appropriateness for any adapted style to Mission Hills. It is just creating the framework by which those essential characteristics have to be identified.
And there's so much we see so many commonalities between the basic proportional systems that generate facades of big two-story houses in many styles, and there's certain proportional and relationships between strong verticals and strong horizontals that apply to mid-century modern, some good contemporary homes, that an architect could come in and just say, okay, I'm putting this on the table. I'm not doing any style. This is not any style, but it has the common proportional relationships that you describe for this style or that style. It's stone, it's brick, it's heavy timber, it's exposed steel, whatever. Here we're doing fine materials, we're doing proportional relationships, and we're not saying it's any style. We just think it's beautiful. What do you think?
That's what they're saying to us. And then we'll say, well, bring us pictures of what you're conceptually trying to do. And then we can kind of wiggle around that. That's basically what they're doing.
Well,
this is transitional, and this is an educated, respected architect.
Yes. Well, I think a lot of it's going to be that you need to have more information on the table when the professional staff is talking to them in the early going, so they don't spend $75,000, on a design that nobody likes.
And that PRP committee is greatly helped. It's been added.
Yes, it's incredible. Yeah, we always recommend that because the applicant is bringing in professional people to advocate their side of the story, and you need to have pros on your side of the table. Otherwise, it's just not sort of a fair argument. You don't send your contractor to meet with somebody's lawyer. Okay, so we'll, and then there's excuse me, that's coming. So then the adaptive or transitional, this is another picture we just found. It's sort of Tudor-ish maybe, or is it Swiss chalet? We're not sure.
It's French country where they built it.
Oh, was it? Okay. And maybe it's okay and maybe it's not okay, but we think it's a little busy. And so they need to tell you what style they're doing and what they're adapting. And in this, I would say in Kevin's house, I don't know that that's adapted from it. Well, I shouldn't speak for Kevin. Good grief, he's a distinguished architect, and I have a huge respect for him. But I don't think that's an adaptation of really any style. I think that's just a beautiful house that has the massing proportions from modern houses with traditional details elegantly drawn, and a balance of modern elements and traditional elements. I think contemporary essentially is a skillful intermixture of modern compositional techniques and traditional elements of style and detailing. So I think that's basically what we're talking about. Is it adaptive? Is it transitional? Is it contemporary? Yes. And then you have people wanting to do farmhouse. So is that a style that belongs in Mission Hills, or should it be like farmhouse elevated? Should it be a farmhouse done in more luxurious materials? Should it be a ranch house but with a copper roof and stone walls?
It's coming. Farmhouse is coming.
Okay. Well,
Mission Hills, because I see it built around us.
yeah.
I see it built in Prairie.
Well, then you just got to make sure it's really good farmhouse.
This is like transitional. If we're trying to make these longer than 2-year guidelines,
Yeah.
we hear the ARB saying we should be looking at farmhouse.
Okay. then we need to, well, and by the way, there's a lot of farmhouses that are basically Gothic revival. It depends on which part of the country you're in and when they were built. There's a lot of Italianate farmhouses in California, and there's a lot of Gothic revival farmhouses in the Midwest. You know, the one behind the American Gothic couple with the pitchfork? That's Victorian. It's a farmhouse, yeah. So farmhouse is a little bit of a broad category. It's a little bit like contemporary. A farmhouse is sort of whatever you wanted to have on your farm. Oh, I'm clicking the wrong button, sorry. And then we think that contemporary, is that contemporary or modern or mid-century? Now these are just a few pictures I found just to talk about general characteristics. This isn't specifically Mission Hill's problems, but this kind of composition with a large solid piece, large volumes with a lot of glass, strong horizontal. So here you've got a strong horizontal, you've got strong verticals, you've got strong horizontals, you've got a strong base, and this piece is sitting right down on the ground. This is sloping down the site, by the way. So I presume on this side it's a one-story house, and on this side you've got bedrooms on the lower. So I would, you know, what style is that? Well, I don't know, contemporary, modern, but the in my opinion, it works. Now, whether you want it next to your house in Mission Hills is another story, but if somebody came in with something like it, well, actually, the house next door to Kevin's is not totally different from this, with these strong horizontal roofs. So again, it's basically fine materials, clear, simple volumes, and strong verticals and strong horizontals that balance in a dynamic rather than a static way. The Mediterranean is a very static, you know, it's a big stone house. It's just sitting there looking beautiful. There's a lot more movement going on here, but it's not, but I wouldn't call it busy. It's just more dynamic. So if we can describe some of those characteristics to help you with the contemporary thing, we'll do so. And then, you've got this house already. You probably that's the Hall House. Now, actually, this was designed by two of my professors from architecture school. I'm not here to sell you the house, but I'm saying that's an abstraction of traditional architecture. That's very much a modern reinterpretation of traditional house forms, which is, I'm sure, what Danny and John had in mind when they drew this. I haven't ever talked to either one of them about it. I was long out of school before they designed this.
It was wildly controversial at the time.
And so what's the general? Well, right now you can hardly see it. There's so many trees.
Right.
So that doesn't hurt. Is there any consensus about whether anything like this could ever happen again? One of these, there's the whole question of context. When you're in a tight context where you're close to another house, and that's one thing. If you're on a really big lot where your house is like 50 or 60 feet from all the other houses and there's trees in between, that strikes me as a pretty different scenario. Where basically, if it looks like, you know, if it's a nice looking thing and it's just sitting there in the green landscape with trees all around it, okay. But if
it's got a really wide lot.
Yes.
And there's not very many lots like that.
Right. I'm not saying this is prototypical. I was just putting it up sort of to generate a little conversation, because there's a very distinguished modern architect named Hugh Newell Jacobson Architects, who has been abstracting traditional house forms into very stylized, sculptural, modern forms, detailing them just beautifully. Well, you know, where's the main mass? You know, is that how wings are supposed to do? Well, this is another case of a one-story composition that probably doesn't have to follow the rules that you'd follow for a big two-story estate. There's, you know, and having that look out onto your backyard. You know, these are related to the Hall House, but I think they're really quite elegant. So do you want to allow for that in contemporary? Do you want to allow for that kind of abstraction and basically alternative massing, very different massing schemes, if they're clear and simple, or do you want to just sort of stay away from that? That's, you know. I'm not selling this, I'm just showing pictures of it, because it's going to come up.
It's going to come up, but I think we have to allow for some contemporary design because it's becoming a larger part of the housing market.
Because this is has some relation to postmodernism, actually. You know, it's not unlike some of the stuff Michael Graves was doing in the 70s. Well, that's a different story. But you know, so one version of, so like the house I showed, sorry. This house, that's sort of a contemporary version of, it's more like a contemporary version of mid-century modern, if you will. Whereas these are like contemporary versions of Tudor, or just, I mean, that could be an abstraction of farmhouse. It's an abstract composition using traditional forms and modern detailing. And if this was like 20 feet away from a one-story Cape Cod colonial, maybe not so much. But if it's on a pretty large lot where it's got some room to breathe, do you generally agree with what she said? We're just trying to help you get ahead of some of this so you don't have new problems sneak up on you. Okay. Oh, and then modern, you've got a modern house by a very distinguished modern architect named Breuer, and I think it's been restored since we did the guidelines. It was not. Well, hi, I didn't. It's been restored, you know, in the last few years. It didn't look that nice last time we were here, and it's a modern house. I mean. It's got a lot of the same characteristics of Corbusier's. You know, the people live upstairs and not so much down on the ground. It's completely horizontal. It's got a lot of acrobatic stuff going on. But on the other hand, it's basically it's an object sitting in the landscape. And there's, in general, the original J.C. Nichols' idea of Mission Hills, we think, was basically objects in the landscape. It was country living. It was living in the countryside. It was, how would you like a big house in the country? And so obviously it's country manicured, not wild. But that's it's not big on its lot. It's just sitting there as a somewhat idiosyncratic, but you know, nice looking sculptural object. And then we think if you sort of sit that down onto the ground, okay, then if you're going to do modern, is that contemporary or modern? Well, yes, both and so it doesn't have a main mass, but it's not so much mass as it's volumes, and you're getting these strong stone elements that are supporting it. You're getting strong steel and glass, prismatic volumes. You're getting a simple low roof that doesn't impose itself. It's not top heavy. It's beautifully connected to its site. The space just flows right out from the rooms into the site.
I'd like to ask Gail and Jill, how do we ever put that in the guidelines, what David just said? Because once you said that, I see what you're saying about that, as opposed to other contemporary. But is it possible to write guidelines that are almost aesthetically driven as your description?
Well, there's ways of describing it as architectural critics would describe, interpenetrating volumes. It's basically glass cubes that overlap and express. And now, that's pretty much three. It's pretty much three main volumes. You've got this volume, this volume, and this volume, and then you've got a porch coming out from it. So it's not just busyness.
I'm just thinking that we need to arm the ARB.
We get it.
To make this distinction from other plans, and I don't know how we do it.
Well, let it,
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
The building material.
It's terribly important. Yeah, if all that stone was stucco, not so much. And if the roofs were 12 pitches, hell no.
Or even flat.
Or,
I don't think flat roofs work in our city because they're so likely to be on a hill to be able to see it coming from one direction.
well, there's some flat, I think there may be some flat pieces on here. I don't know. I just got the picture. I mean, that's almost a sort of a prairie style piece up at the top there. It's a little piece of Frank Lloyd Wright with that low roof sitting on the glass. And then, what about this? This doesn't have a pitched roof. It's strong. Again, it's fine materials. I'm not here to sell it to you. I'm just asking you. It's got strong horizontals and distinct verticals and transparent volumes.
And I think those are all words that we can benefit from in guidelines.
Because so far we've just been focused on mass. We didn't talk enough about facade versus roof. We didn't talk about solid versus void. We didn't describe that there might be a volume more than a mass. Because we're so enamored of the Tudors, the Colonials, the Neoclassicals, that we didn't dig deep enough into this kind of house. So let us take a shot at some criteria, and you can tell us what you think.
One small piece that I would add as well on that topic, I think there's an overriding guideline that applies to all topics, and that's the idea of understated elegance. And I think for each of the topics, the sort of subtopics of guidelines within Chapter 2 of this document, linking, whether it's massing guidelines, whether it's architectural style guidelines, linking those back to that guiding guideline of overriding guideline of understated elegance, and describing how you do that with each of these elements of the home design and composition, I think is going to be key.
One of the key topics is what we were chatting about before. I don't remember if we talked about it, but I was chatting with Bill about it. It's essentially visual structure, so that all of these houses, so here, these are obviously steel columns. And steel columns that big can absolutely support a horizontal like that. If it was just glass, it couldn't. And what you're getting on some of these houses, they're just stucco boxes, and you've got these thin little strips of stucco in between the windows. So the aesthetic of the house is it's just stucco, but the style of the house is based on a masonry house, and there's no way you can have 2 inches of stucco between the windows holding up a stone structure above. So this, does it look like those steel columns and those stone piers can support that roof? Yes. So a lot of it's just about balance and just visual, does it make sense visually that could hold itself up? I mean, that goes through a lot of architecture. That's why in styles that were originally made of stone, you have tall, thin windows, often with arches, because otherwise they would fall down. And so if you're going to adapt that, don't suddenly put in ribbon windows in a style that was supposed to be originally made out of stone. Just don't. If you want to but if somebody wanted to really reinterpret a stone building typology with some wider windows, maybe they could put even like wide flange metal posts between. If they really wanted to marry modern, they could put, you got steel posts. Actually, I did a retail building in a downtown where we reinterpreted the historic building with exposed structural steel. Looks really good. It's not traditional, but it doesn't look like it's about to fall down either. And it hasn't, I'm happy to tell you. And now, this is an extreme example. I just put it, but now this wouldn't make sense next to a 2-story colonial. But if you had a big enough lot, would something even this sort of acrobatic, I mean, it's basically sculpture. And on a big lot where you weren't next to another house, you don't have to answer, but I mean, and maybe that's just too much, but it's a lovely modern house that has beautiful views of everything around it, and if it wasn't imposing itself on a neighbor, would that just be too damn much? And feel free to say yes, or whatever you think. And that's probably the least important question. I just thought I'd show you sort of an extreme example and see what you think. If that was on a lot like where the Hall House is, yeah. So really, the more space, I think there's a simple idea here, which is the more space and the more landscape there is between a new house and all the other houses, the differenter it can be. And because it's just relating to its own, now actually, this is interesting. You can see in the background here that it's fairly close to a house that looks very different. Maybe that's not a good thing. But maybe, I think we already have guidelines about if you're real close, you've got to pay more attention to how much your ground floor is or is not higher than your neighbor, and your roof is or is not higher than your neighbor. But it seems like the more space there is around your house, the more, at some point, it's just a beautiful house that you're seeing in relation to its own self and the trees, not in relation to somebody's 1.5-story colonial. That, in concept, that seemed, I mean, maybe, is there a site in one, and then you get into the mid-century modern, where it's just, I mean, that strikes me as a gorgeous thing. And it's just a house that looks out into its green lot. And as long as it's not right next to a house that is strikingly different, it could be a beautiful way to live, we think. Because really the essence of a house, it's a house in the country. And this house is unified with its country in a way that most of the traditional houses in town are not. I mean, you got all outdoors in your house all the time. And so the other thing, I did this for mass, so here, you've got a mass, you've got a blank wall, which is characteristic of many mid-century houses, and then you've got a completely transparent volume, and then you've got a recess, a porch, in a non-traditional way in between, and then you've got this one, which we really, I don't know where it is, I just really like it. You've got a short wing there, then you've got that massive chimney piece, which is a strong massing break and accent. You've got a long, low wing, and you've got the entry at the corner. It's a simple 3-part composition. Is there a main mass? Nope. In a 1-story horizontal house, do you need a main mass? Probably not. So this just strikes me as a decent example of, again, not 20 feet away from a Cape Cod, but if it's not right up next to a house that it's very much out of character with, it seems to me this kind, and somebody really wants a 1-story house. They don't want to make it tall. They don't want to make it shout, look at me. It seems like this version of mid-century could be a useful thing. Does that seem generally? I'm sorry. Were you going to say something, sir? Okay. We're at the end. That's it. So what I'm hearing is that the more clearly we can describe the essential characteristics of some of these styles as a starting point for adaptation, if the process can get more critically important information on the table early on and get the applicant to tell you what their story is and tell you that they're going to stick to it, about, okay, here's the mass, here's the main mass, or we're doing one of these and we don't need a main mass, but here's how the house is organized on the lot, here's how it relates to the house next door, here's the materials we're using. And then you can say, well, that sounds pretty promising, and then they can go on and do a full design, and then they don't end up in front of the ARB with a huge controversy.
Could I extend this just one more step? Because what I see happening with the ARB is the lots that were built for this kind of a house in the southern part of the city are built for ranches, long, low houses. They're shallow lots, wider than they are deep. And people are filling those in now with significantly more, double the size of the original 2,200 square foot ranch house. Is there anything here that we can do about that issue of filling in the lot? I know we say you can't hit all the maximums, but I think this is what we're going to see in the next few years south of in South Mission Hills. Can we just say that's too big for the way we say in the design guidelines that we have to respect the way they're platted, Jill, the way it was originally platted? But they're taking advantage of these ranch house lots to put in higher, chunkier houses.
Like bigger two-story houses where there used to be a small one-story.
Story and a half, and when you put in a 10-foot first floor and you raise the sill plate 1.5 feet, and then you put in a roof line, yeah, you're getting two-story heights.
Mm-hmm.
And a side entry garage, which shoves it to the one side.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess there's always whenever in city planning of every kind, when the one thing about the one thing that never changes is that things change, and so you're allowing things to go in that aren't the same as what was there, and if you've got a 30-year or 20-year or 50-year vision of what might be there later, there's going to be interim conditions where if, say, all the houses for 3 blocks are all 1 story, and somebody comes in and they say, I'm going to do a 2-story, well, that might be the only 2-story house there for a long time, or you might get 10 of them in the next 7 years. So there's going to be adjacencies that aren't the same as they used to be. So one possibility that occurs to me, and actually this is a common technique in architectural design, whether it's urban infill in a downtown setting or whatever. Maybe if you're infilling 2-story houses in a 1-story setting, maybe we should find ways to encourage people to pick a design that has a strong 1-story scale on top of which, and not to do a 1-story house with another 1-story house just slapped on top of it, but to do, okay, so that, you could say, well, that certainly has a strong one, so if that was next to a 1-story house, it could look, if it was next to a horizontally designed 1-story house, that could look pretty cool, and it would be 2 stories. This has, I never thought of this, it just got lucky here. There's a very strong 1-story scale to that. The stone and the porch roof, there's a strong 1-story scale, above which the 2nd story is very light. So that might look pretty good next to a 1-story house. I don't know about that. Well, that's next to Kevin's house. Well, I don't know about that, but anyway, I'm not going to go back anywhere. But there's a strong 1-story piece on that too. So maybe there's a guideline that when you're going into those contexts, you don't do something that's just vertical, 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 vertical. You go in with something that has and really, we do a lot of development standards, zoning, and design guidelines for downtowns, including we're doing one right now in downtown Santa Clara, in the middle of the Silicon Valley, where they had a classic 10-block downtown that they demolished in 1965 because they thought they were going to get a shopping mall. They didn't. So we're doing a new downtown from scratch for them. And one of the keys is that if you're going to have some 1- and 2-story buildings, and then they even want to allow up to 6-story buildings. But if the 6-story buildings have a strong 1 and/or 2-story base element on top of which, not a hard break, but a strong 1 or 2-story scale to the bottom of it. And there's downtowns all over the country that have a lot of old 1-story shop fronts, and then there will be a 5-story building. But the 5-story building has a 1-story shop front that goes nicely with all the other 1-story shop fronts, and it just happens to keep on going up. So perhaps
I think that
perhaps
concept's
there's a
important.
strategy here.
Because when we began this process, 15 years ago, we saw the beginning of the transition of 68th Street as it began
Yes.
to go to a different building style. What you're talking about would allow us to transition if inevitably South Mission Hills is going to transition to something different. Those kinds of concepts would allow that to happen without just extreme disjunctures between houses and blocks.
And if 50 years from now, it ended up being 40% the classic 1-stories are still there, and 60% there's 2, or 20% 2-story and 80% are still 1-story. It would just work. So basically, you're coming up with some strategies so that whether the interim, transitional, in the sense of process, not in the sense of that being a style. If the transition takes, 10 years or 100 years, it'll at each stage it'll look okay. And again, we're coming back to the basics of proportion and balance of vertical and horizontal, which is just fundamental to all architecture, as you know. And I think we can add some clear descriptions of those. So, style, yeah, there's style, but there's also just form and organization and proportion. And I think we can describe those in relation to each other. That'll give you a little more depth rather than them just saying, well, it looks kind of French to me. So, basically the style, you don't want style to be the tail that wags your dog. Anything else, or Jill? Do you want to?
Are you done with your part?
Well, it's not my part, it's their part.
Any more questions, David, or comments? Okay.
Thank you so much. We've been dying to help. It's absolutely our pleasure, and I've been looking forward to a chance to chat with you folks for a long time. Thank you.
So in addition to the topics that Sargent Town Planning is working on, the Planning Commission is also going to discuss other topics over the next several months, so I thought we'd just run through those. First one is they're going to look at the green space recommendation to see if it needs to be changed for new homes. We've had new homes come in, and let's say they needed 60% green space, and they come in with exactly 60% green space. And so they get approved, they come through the process, halfway through construction they realize, oh, I really want a hammerhead, or oh, I want to expand my patio to get, a hot tub on it. Well, they don't have any room to do that. And so we're thinking about maybe requiring new homes to come over, instead of 60%, maybe they need to have 60.5%, just to build in a little bit of cushion for things that they didn't plan for. We've had some instances where they've gotten caught in that situation. They said, well, I'll just take out my front walk and not have a front walk. Well, then that's gonna look a little odd. So that's just one thing the Planning Commission is gonna be looking at and talking about. Second one, raised first floor elevations for new homes. Consider creating a limit for how much a home can be raised above the normal grade. We've had a couple of issues with that. Also, along what Mark Eisman was talking about, we're also going to look at raised pool and outdoor living areas. Consider creating a design guideline recommendation. The thing now is to just walk out your back door straight onto your pool deck and not step down. And so that causes all your outdoor living area, your pool deck, and everything else to be raised out of the ground, more visible to your neighbors. So that is another thing that they're going to be looking at. Okay, so we're going to have you vote. So get your phones out or computers out. We're going to talk about 3 topics, and you get to vote about these topics. So we're going to look at solar panels. So just so you understand, these are solar panels on the back of a house in Mission Hills, and so this is what we're talking about. You can't have the raised off, you know, where you can tilt it different ways to get the best raise. Those aren't allowed, but this is what we're talking about, just regular solar panels. So if you want to go to slido.com, and then you're going to put in this code here, you're going to answer the question, should the design guidelines be changed to allow solar panels to be visible from the street? So that would allow them on the front of the home or on the sides of the home if there are corner lots. So that's the question. And so here again is the address slido.com, and it will say, joining as a participant, enter code here, and then this is your code, 3223527. And then you can answer no, yes, or I'm not sure, I'd like to know more.
Joe, could we call those solar shingles? Because everybody has a vision of solar panels.
Well, solar shingles are more like Tesla, where that was not a solar shingle.
Tesla also makes solar panels.
Yes.
They do both.
Yeah. And we had one new homeowner look into the Tesla, but I think it was cost prohibitive.
But they wouldn't be right on every house.
No. Yeah.
Are we voting now?
Yeah. Yep. So this is live. So we're recording your votes.
Oh, it's live. Can I ask a quick question? On solar panels on the front of the home and on the back, do they provide use of glare to the neighbors?
Depends on the unit. Most of the new ones are more matte finished. The old 70s ones, yeah, were basically a glass box, 6-7 inches thick, and it's on a tilt up. That's kind of changed. Now it's more of a matte black. It's faded 2 to 3 inches thick. That's a thick one. And now they're mounted directly to whatever pitch your roof. The newer ones don't even have that optimum sun angle anymore, so they're able to put them on west sides, east sides. They don't have to always be on the south side of the house.
There's a house on Tomahawk, kind of a relatively new house, and they're south facing, but they have all their solar panels on the west roof and on their back roof, actually.
This is coming up because we have an application to the ARB for a couple of panels to be installed on it.
Yeah, on the front of the house, and the design guidelines are against it, so that it was denied, and then they came to the city council and asked if that was something that the planning commission could look at again.
We didn't deny it.
Did they withdraw? Okay.
You deferred to the council.
Yeah.
We didn't deny it because we had thought the council should be involved since it's the Mission Hills. It's not actually contrary to the
Okay, so everybody voted, had a chance to vote? Okay, we'll go on to the next one. Okay, so this is a driveway made of 2 strips. When we adopted the green space recommendation, there were other cities who were kind of doing the same thing with impervious surface, and they had people to get around the impervious surface rule start putting in strip driveways, and they didn't want those in their city, so they created a rule against them. And so as the Planning Commission was talking about the green space recommendation, they were like, well, do we want everybody to put these in? They said no. So in our zoning regulations, when it talks about the definition of a driveway, it says a driveway is not 2 strips of concrete that you would drive on. So we're going to go to the question here. That is in Mission Hills, by the way. That one's in Mission Hills. So again, the strip driveway, should the zoning regulations be changed to allow 2 concrete or brick or asphalt strips to be used as a driveway? And again, there's the slido.com.
Jill, is this a question about appearance or is this a question about impervious surface?
Appearance.
allow this, we can say that's true, it's not count towards your green space.
So that is the contradiction, isn't it? I mean, we allow it, but you can't get the credit for the impervious.
Actually, we don't allow it, and if we do allow it,
Oh.
right now, what you can't do is do things. That was
This is
already.
really, this is a cosmetic question.
Yeah.
Okay. Could you,
We could, that's a whole nother, question. So also, and David, we were talking with David about this, and he said, they work better on really straight drives because your wheels will pretty much stay on the strips easier, but they're not so good if you have a circle driveway or any type of a curb because you're going to tend to drive off onto the grass, and over time you're going to kill the grass, but for a straight drive, not so
Jill,
bad.
something important that you said about this the other day was that if we were to allow those, should those also not count towards the green space requirements?
That's just, someone brought that up as a possibility to do that.
Since it's been attempted as a way to get around the green space.
But if it's not a problem with it, do we matter if they count the green space or not? I mean, I don't know, it depends. Casey?
But I tell you, if those are any longer than the 20 feet there was from the curb to my grandparents' garage, no one's going to stay on those two strips. So.
And then again, you're going to eventually over time, as you drive on your yard, you're going to compact the soil and it's going to end up not being impervious earth. Okay, has everybody had a chance to?
One thing I would add is Craig Village has this, right? The way Craig Village does their maximum lot coverage is they have a maximum lot coverage, like our green space, and that's the only one they have. So whenever somebody comes in and they realize, oh, I want to add on that sunroom on the back of my house, but I'm already at a maximum, I'll cut the center of my driveway out. So that's why I was want to suggest that if we do this, it should not be allowed to go towards your green space because that's when we'll have to start happening.
Absolutely.
Jill, I'd like to add the first one about the lot space coverage in the ARB. Oftentimes we have felt that when someone builds to the limit, comes back and realizes they can't do something else they wanted to do, we given to more considering that to be a strategy, not a revelation.
True. True. Yeah, very well put. Okay. So then the third one here, this is about ground cover. We don't have a picture for that because you pretty much know what that is. So is it okay for properties to not have any grass but instead have clover or other ground cover? They have new species of clover and other vegetation now that you barely have to water, no chemicals. You don't have to mow it, it stays really low. The new clovers, there's not flowers everywhere. And so it's just a way to reduce water and chemical consumption for your yard.
Is there a lot of weed that can, I mean, the question to me is it, like you said, that you don't have to mow it, it stays really low, they still have to weed maintain and all that?
Right, like yes. And currently, this is allowed, but we haven't had anyone ever do it. And so someone called.
There's one yard on Tomahawk that is.
Okay, that we know of, because someone called the other day and said, hey, these people, I don't see any grass on their yard, at least from where I'm seeing. Is it okay that most of their yard is not grass? And then we were like, that's something we haven't really had come up. And we totally allow that to happen now. But is that okay with everybody if people don't have any grass on their property? So that's the question. So if you want to go.
On 71st Street back in the Hills Country Club, it's all riot and it's front yard. Instead of grass.
In Greater Village.
In Greater Village.
Yeah.
And definitely those houses that are on slopes, that is mostly some sort of ivy. You can't obviously have grass there. So is it okay for properties to not have any grass but instead have clover or other ground cover? And again, just aesthetically, do you think that's okay to happen?
See, this is an interesting problem, because if we're worried about water drainage, any of these properties, if these grasses don't need as much water, then that's helping. It's a water drainage problem.
And just water use.
Well, you mean you're not going to be having your sprinkler on all the time? speaking at the end? Okay, well, that is it. If you have any thoughts about these topics, my email is on our website. You can email me and let me know, and I can bring those to the Planning Commission when we start going through these. Just so you know, it does take a while for the Planning Commission to get through a lot of these topics that we're going to talk about, especially changes to the design guidelines and these. It's not a quick fix. So probably over the next year or so, they're going to be working through all of these. But okay, well, thank you all for coming and participating. We really appreciate it. Have a good evening.